about decision rights? I mean, aren't they, to a large extent, endogenous? I mean, who gets decision rights? How are they allocated? They seem to be important in your story, but
Well, the way I think about decision rights is that they are property rights. They are rights. They are rights of ownership. And so, if you own the necessary assets, then you have these decision rights. So I'm sort of thinking about decision rights in a kind of residual claim, a kind of Oliver Hart sort of way, that they're the residual, or Henry Hansman, the sort of residual rights of control to redeploy assets.
I understand that, but I would have thought that those decision rights would be accruing to you after you have already made an earlier breakthrough that gave you those decision rights in the first place.
Well, the breakthrough doesn't give you the decision rights, so you
No, but they could. You could inherit them, I suppose, but
right.
they have to come from somewhere.
Right. I mean, you could come up with a systemic innovation and not be able to implement it unless you have the decision right. So my favorite example is Gustavus Swift, right? So Swift comes up with this great idea to have refrigerated meat packing, so we can ship dressed beef to the East Coast instead of shipping the cows with their hooves and everything. So he goes to railroad car makers and say, I got this great idea, will you please make me some refrigerated railroad cars? And they kick him out and they say, that's the craziest idea I've ever heard. And the railroads won't deal with him, and the ice houses are unreliable, right? So he just doesn't have the decision rights to be able to implement this. So what does he do? He starts his own company and has the decision rights, and so he is now a vertically integrated enterprise, and you had to have been a vertically integrated enterprise in order to implement these decision rights. Whereas if you think about, say, the personal computer, you've got exactly the opposite situation, right? Where you can make one little piece of it, because it's a modular system, you can make one little piece of it without having to consult other people. If you're making a motherboard, you don't have to consult the people who are making, you consult them through the standards, right? People who make the disk drive, people who make the monitor, people who make the keyboard, right? You don't need to have the decision rights for that systemic innovation in the same way.
No, I understand that, but what I'm saying is what your paper should perhaps do is to talk about the simultaneous emergence then of decision rights and these types of innovations that you're talking about, because if you don't get decision rights, you may end up, with a good idea and nothing else, as of course many people were.
Right.
But so the ability to innovate depends on, even if you don't have the decision rights, to somehow acquire them by starting your own company or partnering with somebody as decision rights.
I think that is the point. I mean, that was the Sprague story, that it just didn't happen until somebody came along who could have all the decision rights. Before that, people were trying to solve one problem, but they couldn't solve the other problems at the same time because they didn't have control over those problems. So I think I don't disagree with you at all. So.
I like very much the title of your paper. Absolutely.
Changing it, but
that goes, no, please don't do it. Because it goes to the tradition of, different ways of looking at innovation as Smith, Rosenberg or Klepper, whatever. But I want to ask a provocative question to you. Your discussion, which I totally agree with your discussion, is based on activities, organization, structure of production. And then we all agree that all these activities, organization that involve problem solving or division of labor or spin-off do not involve recombination. And this was your starting point of the paper. The question to you is, if you look at innovation as recombination of knowledge, don't you think that fission, forking, and fine-tuning all represent recombination of knowledge? And this is my provocative question to you.
I guess in some abstract sense. I mean, I think the only thing that I really thought of that you couldn't say is some kind of recombination is probably Smith's idea about dexterity, right? So learning by doing as pure dexterity isn't necessarily recombination. It's just repetition. So you do it more and more, and you fine-tune your routines. and that it's not clear that that requires recombination. I mean, some kinds of learning by doing will involve recombination, right? So you figure out that while you're working, that if I take some idea from over here, that's actually going to help me do this. But it's not. I think that's the only part where you couldn't talk about recombination. Fission is a kind of it's a decombination, right? So we think about recombination is putting things together, but the division of labor is actually splitting things apart, and I suppose you can call that recombination if you want. So.
I agree. Even though, even in Smith way, specialization may mean recombination, meaning that you go deeper, kind of deepening process, and
Yes.
therefore you may recombine knowledge in various ways.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I like this project very much. And in response to an earlier question, you had said that decision rights would essentially be a function of property rights, and I was interested in exploring that further. And I wanted to bring David Teese perspective into this, because it seems that to realize some of these recombinations, you need to have property rights, not necessarily legal property rights, but economic ownership rights, not only over the ideas, but you need a suite of complementary assets that are necessary to realize them. So an example that I'm familiar with would be the Singer sewing machine. So one reason that is sometimes attributed to Singer's success is not necessarily any superiority of his technology, but innovations in credit financing and marketing. And that may be part of the story in the electric car example that you talked about, electric trolley. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I'm talking. My perspective is actually very close to Teese in all of this. Do you have to own all the complements? Not necessarily. So you could, it might be possible to get some of these complements through contract. So Gustavus Swift could have persuaded a maker of railroad cars to go in with him on this, right? And they would stay as separate enterprises, but they would cooperate. But that's sometimes costly. Right, it becomes less costly the more modular the product is or the process is. But if there's a lot of new knowledge and sort of inchoate, if the project is sort of inchoate, it becomes much more costly to do that through to have the complements through contract. So you have to own them, would be the argument. You have a question there?
Yes. Yes.
Rebecca.
Yes. So I think this is really interesting. I really think that this idea of decision rights as a constraint on the uptake of technologies is really a powerful one that applies in a lot of contexts. And I think it's sort of related to the branding paper, actually. I think one thing that branding does is it drives the uptake of a particular new innovation. In a way that might otherwise not happen. It's a way of persuading some other decision maker to take your piece of the puzzle and go with that. Sometimes that works. Sometimes you need other kinds of approaches, like we could pick, spinning off a company or getting yourself appointed the czar of the trolley system or something like that. But one thing that you can do is just try to persuade people to the actual decision maker, and that can be a really important driver of a new technology.
Right. No, I think that's right. So I mean, it's partly a matter of standards. So if you say I'm an app developer for Apple, is that because of the brand or is that because those are the standards? But the brand is something that's a little bit bigger than the standards. I'm in the Apple ecosystem or something, and maybe that the knowledge that ecosystem exists is a way of helping to lower the transaction costs of engaging in a lot of complementary activities. Yeah. That's a good idea. I left everybody stupefied. That's normally
we still have a little bit of time left, and so time for more questions, comments. David?
I just would like to respond to your point about dexterity, that dexterity is just about repetition. And I guess I kind of have a a Popperian reaction to that, because it's not really just repetition, is it? Because to get dexterity, you do experiment with alternatives. There is a conjectural part of becoming better at something. It's not just sheer repetition of doing something exactly the same way. There is a learning process that goes on. There's a trial and experiment process, I think, that's going on there.
Right. No, I think that's right. In fact, I sort of say something a little bit like that. I mean, I suggested, for example, if you're learning a line to be better as a line production worker, you might use some idea that you learned in a sport to make you, more dexterous. So, no, I don't disagree. I don't disagree with that. All right.
Economists are always talking about markets for this and markets for that. I'm just wondering, you have here the person, Sprague, who figures it out, then going and trying to having the decision, trying to get the decision rights and by creating his own firm, okay?
Yeah, sort of.
Why only?
Well, I
Sprague?
mean, in the case of Sprague, this is more about. I would think this is more a story about. He provided the mechanism. He gave decision rights to Charles Spork, who was one of the inventors of the integrated circuit. And so Spork didn't have the decision rights he needed when he was still at Fairchild, and so he quit Fairchild, and this guy who was kind of who was really an entrepreneur. Said, yeah, come work for me and you can do whatever you want, you can be in charge and we'll do things your way. And so he owned the decision rights, but he basically gave de facto decision rights to Charles Spork to run the place.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of the first.
Yeah, the other.
Yeah.
The other Sprague, yeah.
Okay, so therefore there seems to be so you can go out into the market, so to speak, and buy, in effect, or hire someone to have the decision rights. Right? You don't have, in other words, the person who does the innovation, who has the idea of the innovation, doesn't have to be the decision maker, right? He can go out into the market and hire somebody to be
Right.
the decision maker.
Right.
Okay, so
But you still have the residual rights of control. It's sort of Frank Knight.
yeah, you have okay, presumably you have the residual rights of control, although, does it have to be that way?
You may not have de facto control, but you have the residual control rights, and it might be, this is a Henry Hansman point, it might be efficient for you to hold the residual rights of control even if you don't have the de facto rights of control.
Okay, so are there characteristics of maybe you don't like this, of the market for decision makers?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't just go and choose anybody to be the decision maker.
Right.
So the guy who's the innovator has to have some notion of, who would be a good decision maker, but he also has to have some information about what's available out there. I guess what I'm trying to imagine is, what that market looks like. I have an idea, and I want to find myself a good person to give the totality of the decision rights to.
Mm-hmm.
So what do I do?
Well, I think it's sort of like you go to the market for the next 15,000 in Joel's story, right? So if you're decided that you're going to mechanize match production in Sweden, that you realize it's time to get it, instead of putting out to people in their cottages, we're going to mechanize this. So I'll go to Stockholm and I'll hire the best mechanical engineers that are there, and they'll come out to Jönköping and they'll set up machines to make matches for me. But I'm still got the residual rights. I don't know anything about machines, but I know matches, and I'll watch what they're doing, and and that's sort of what the younger Sprague did. He saw that Charles Spork was somebody who was one of the defectors, and he knew what he was doing, and we're going to hire him, and he's going to make semiconductors for us.
Frederick? Yeah, I just had a follow up on what on what David Harper was saying. There's the the whole literature on expertise development, Anders Ericsson and all of that, and they talk about repetition and whether or not it's
Yeah, I only know Malcolm Gladwell.
well, Gladwell is the one who definitely, but the idea of deliberate practice, I think, is very interesting in that literature, and how they study, how sports people do that, and so little, changes in the way they practice, and so it seems to me that that goes
Yeah,
exactly
it
along.
might be worth saying a little bit about that.
Jason?
Yeah, so this is a courtesy and bargaining situation that you're framing this as, and you mentioned Oliver Hart in passing, but I was wondering to what extent this fits into the Schleifer framework, in the sense that one of the possible residuals when no one else can agree is that it falls into a regulatory decision, basically a regulatory merges, in the sense of this kind of best but worst case solution, or an industry association or some kind of collective governing body. And an example of this that's happening right now is in cryptocurrencies around Bitcoin, where you've got this situation where it's exactly this situation. A lot of residual decision rights have to happen for the technology platform to shift. And it's not clear who holds those decision rights. You've got this sort of wall breaking out in terms of private associations forming, the bankers are coming together, wondering whether they need to regulate it. We've got all sorts of entrepreneurial startups trying to own the platform. And yeah, it just seems that maybe there's a sort of broader story here.
Yeah, I think you can do without there being a single residual claimant for the whole innovation if the system is extremely modular. But that's seldom the case. So like something like Linux, Linus Torvalds actually acts as a kind of residual claimant because he has to prove everything, right? So there is a kind of residual control there. Could that sometimes fall to a committee? I suppose that's the case. You could have. There's no reason that residual control rights can't be owned in common, but then they have to be. I think you would say they would have to be managed in some Eleanor Ostrom sort of way, because if you own the residual, like in a public firm, right? The residual claim rights are owned by lots and lots of shareholders, and so they have to exercise those residual claim rights through some mechanism of some kind, right? So I think it's significant that we're increasingly seeing very strong owners, right? Somebody like Steve Jobs, who even though it's a public company, he has kind of a super authority to make decisions without consulting the rest of the stockholders. So we do have a single residual residual claimant.
David, do you want to say something to close up the morning?
Yes, so this is the end of the session. Have we run out of time? Well, first of all, I think we should thank our presenters, including myself.